Hey everyone, this is the special 3,000 subscriber episode. Video, I don't know what's an episode of, it's just a video I guess. And I asked you guys on YouTube, on social media, through email to submit your questions for me for celebrating the channel reaching 3,000 subscribers. And I got a bunch, so I'm going to answer them in this little video. But first, before I do that, I'm really excited to announce the Open Source Skateboards virtual board building workshop. At the beginning of this year, or I guess in March, we had to stop doing the in-person workshops, and that gave me an opportunity to create a virtual workshop so you can learn how to make, design, and build skateboards and longboards anywhere. And I recorded basically a full version of my workshop, like the most thorough workshop format I offer, and have a video for it and a reference guide I've created, and you can check that out. I'll play the little sample video at the end for you to check out the little like ad thing that I created for it. Anyways, it's just super thorough. It just goes into a lot of detail on skateboard and longboard design, fabrication, how to get started, troubleshooting, all that good stuff. So I hope you check that out if you are interested in learning to make your own boards. And you'll see, this is the board that I made in it. So I basically built the board as I was explaining how to build boards. So it's like a build along so that you'll follow me as I go through the build of this board. And this board is asymmetrical, which is wild because I haven't made an asymmetrical board for myself since I started making boards over 6 years ago. That was actually one of the biggest reasons I started making skateboards. It was really, really hard to find a truly symmetrical skateboard. And by that I mean one that has an identical nose and tail. And so this board kind of follows what I've seen be very common among asymmetrical boards or most street deck style boards, which is that it has a slightly steeper and longer nose, and it's also a bit more squared off at the nose. So the reason that skateboards are asymmetrical, or one of the big reasons, is that you basically have two geometries to do tricks off of, which is really cool and helpful because you might find certain tricks easier doing off the nose than off the tail, and vice versa. Especially with like single kick boards, like a lot of freestyle boards. A lot of freestylers like that single kick because of the asymmetry and the ability to do certain tricks easier on the nose and certain tricks easier on the tail. And I think some of the big reasons for, like in a street board, why you might have asymmetry is having a steep nose can help catch your foot on ollies and help bring your ollies up a little bit higher and provide some leverage for flip tricks. If you make the nose a little bit steeper though, it increases the pop angle of your board. So the pop angle is the angle that your board makes with the ground when the nose or tail hits. And a steep pop angle on your nose is going to kind of like propel you forward a little bit. It's not super comfortable. A mellower pop angle will be a little bit more responsive and quicker, whereas a big pop angle it's like a little bit more powerful. It can maybe give you a higher ollie, but off the nose it can be a little awkward to have to like work hard to pop it up. So by extending the length of the nose, you can essentially decrease the pop angle. And also by it being a little bit longer and having a little bit more weight at the front, it helps you level out your ollies. That's just my theory. There might be other reasons that I'm missing out on that I don't know of, but from having skated a lot of boards, I mean, up until I started making boards, all the boards I was skating were just standard street boards that were slightly asymmetrical. And that seems to be some of the things that I noticed. Now, the reason I want a symmetrical skateboard is because I just want a board that's going to last me as long as possible. I want to go through decks as slowly as possible. I don't want to have to buy a new deck or make a new deck every month, every 2 months, because I'm wearing them down so fast. A symmetrical board, I can use both sides exactly the same. I don't have to think about whether I'm on the nose or tail. I don't have to change how I do a trick based on being on the nose or tail. And I just really like it because it eliminates having to think about where my board is facing, what direction it's facing, where the front and the back is. And it just helps create a more consistent feel for me across the deck, and my boards just last longer. I'll ride a board for, some of my boards will last me sometimes 6 months on just the deck. And I think my most recent one, just because I've been doing so little skating the past like 10 months or so, I basically only went through like one board in that time. So I just made that asymmetrical one so that you could see how an asymmetrical board would be made in the class. Anyways, that's that. I just wanted to mention that quick thing about asymmetrical boards. And now let's get into the Q&A, all the cues, the questions that you have submitted. So I'm just going to go through in a random order here. I have them on my laptop, which is off the screen right here. And let's see what we've got. So one I have is, the first one, does kick gap basically mean fingers of flat? So this is referring to SkateCAD terminology, and SkateCAD is the design software that's on the Open Source Skateboards website for designing your board. And it's got a bunch of parameters or variables that you can change that define the shape of your board. And yes, kick gap essentially means the distance between your outermost truck holes and where the kick starts to bend. And Paul Schmidt, who's a very well-known skateboard designer and builder, and makes a lot of the mainstream skateboards that are out there, recommends 2 fingers of flat. So basically, if you put your fingers, 2 fingers between the outermost truck holes and the kick, there should be about 1 inch or 2 fingers of flat space before the board starts to curve up. And if you go a little bit smaller, so if you narrow the kick gap, it moves your base plate closer to the tail and makes your pop angle steeper. And if you go too far though, your base plate will hang off the edge of your board. If you go inward, if you make the kick gap bigger, you move your trucks away from the kick more, and it gives you a reduced pop angle. And if you go too far forward, you end up with very little kick, and there's just like a weird like flat spot, and then there's like a little kick at the end. So I recommend about 1 inch. If you check out SkateCAD SB, so if you go to design your own board and you click on use the house molds, there's a system now that I put in place. I have to actually update that. I just realized there's like a bunch of numbers next to all the molds that are there that probably don't make any sense to anyone. But basically, all the molds in SkateCAD that are already there are designed for a specific wheelbase, and it should give you an error if you try and go too far. But basically, whatever size, if you're designing boards and making your own molds, whatever size wheelbase you design your mold for, you're good to go about plus or minus 1 inch in your wheelbase. So if I designed a mold for a 14-inch wheelbase skateboard, I can probably get away with making boards with 13 to 15-inch wheelbases on that mold. If I go much beyond that, it's going to start to feel a little weird. So that was a long answer. Yes, kick gap basically means fingers of flat. Let's see. Is it possible for some random guy with no industry ties to make money selling their own boards? Sure. Yeah. go for it. Just don't price your boards too low. It's a business if you want it to be a business. I think a common issue with people that get into board building is they price their boards similar to how much a shop deck might cost. And shop decks and factory made boards have a huge advantage over you. First of all, most of them are not based in the US. And a lot of them are made places with very, very cheap labor. Just for example, I actually looked this up right before I recorded this video. I didn't validate it, so if anyone wants to verify or correct this, please do. I think the minimum wage at the time of me recording this in Mexico is $6.15 a day. And in China, it's $2.24 a day. So the cost of labor is really low very often. There are, of course, people making boards at large scale outside of those countries. They also may have a lot of automation equipment and robotics in place to basically take out human labor. So really look at your cost of what it's going to cost you to make a board. Factories are also dealing with benefits of buying at huge scales of veneers and glue and things like that. So they have costs very, very low. And this just comes back to what I think I see the issue most common among board builders is they price their boards similar to these shop decks, and they aren't allowing enough, they're not paying themselves enough, which is fine if you just want to do it as a hobby. But if you really want to create a business and build it into something, and not start to load the process too much, because for me, I don't want to make a lot of the same boards myself. I don't want to just be cutting shapes out on a saw all day. I'm more interested in doing custom stuff. So I think the best way, if you are interested in getting into board building and making your own boards, is coming up with something that is unique, that's just not something similar to a shop deck. Like come up with a unique shape or mold or graphic or something like that, to maybe justify having a higher price tag on your boards. Otherwise, maybe you could figure out how to make it sustainable, but to me it seems like it's really going to be hard to make it sustainable unless you have some sort of advantage that I don't know about, like access to a shop or something. But most people starting to build their own boards, basically doing it at home in their garage or something like that. And if you want to scale up, you're going to need to pay employees and things like that. So don't undervalue your time and go for it. Just try and create something unique and try and find people that will get your boards before you start making them or invest too much. All right, next question. Another one related to SkateCAD. On your one-sided mold page on your site, what do you mean by nose and tail radius? Grab my demo board. The nose and tail radius is the radius of this curve right here. So if this is the tail of the board that I'm holding right now, there's a kicktail angle, and on this I made it 21 degrees. Now the wood can't just go from flat 0 degrees to 21 degrees. There's just going to be, it wouldn't feel right, and it's pretty hard to make the wood bend that way because it's basically got a pinch. So what we do is we bend the wood around a radius, and the bigger this radius is, the more gradually it gets up to the full kick angle. So this radius is what is meant by the kick radius. So the larger the kick radius, the more mellow your board's going to feel because it's going to be more gradual. And I think some longboard dancing shapes might have more of a swoop, like a curved nose and tail design. Most like street board and pool shapes, I think, have a quicker radius, so a smaller radius. And I think I capped that at like 5 inches on SkateCAD. When you go with the method that I use to make boards, going much tighter than that doesn't really work with the molds I use and the process I use. If you're hydraulically pressing, you might be able to get a tighter bend. I don't know what the limit is though, but I like to go with a minimum of 5. So it can be bigger than that, but I wouldn't recommend going much below 5. 4 you can do hydraulically, that I have seen done, but stick around 5 or so if you're looking for like a traditional bend, nose, tail style shape. What is a good way to find the ideal wheelbase for a freestyle board? I would say trial and error. So in my workshops, I have a method for helping people figure out what may be an optimal wheelbase for them. What we do is we take a yardstick, set it on the ground, take one foot and slide it up to the end of the yardstick, the 0 on the yardstick, and then set your other foot down where you think is your most comfortable riding position. And like if you're in a regular riding stance on your board, where you feel most balanced. And then if you look down, that's a good idea for what to make your wheelbase. Whatever tick mark your other foot is on, the inside of your other foot is on. And I'll put a little diagram up right here so you can see that. And that's generally a good ballpark. Now with freestyle though, and just in skating in general, you're going to develop your own preferences and what you like and don't like. I've seen really big guys on really small freestyle boards that crush it, and I've seen little kids on like an adult size board that crush it as well. And it's really a personal thing. What you can try and do if you're interested in experimenting a little bit, probably the cheapest way to do it would be to just drill additional wheelbases on your current board. And that way you can move your trucks around. I think a smaller wheelbase might feel a little bit more sensitive, and a larger wheelbase will be a little bit more stable. And for freestyle, it also depends on like, are you doing more truck transfer tricks, rail flips, footwork? It depends on your style too. So I'm sorry I don't have like a better answer for that question. It's really just experiment. That would be my suggestion for how to find an optimal wheelbase for a freestyle board. All right, next question. Can you carousel? And what do you like about skating a popsicle deck? I cannot carousel. I don't try to learn carousels. I did a little while, like a couple of years ago. I thought it'd be cool to learn them, but I've kind of lost interest in learning that trick. It's a cool trick, it's hard, but it's just not something I really want to be, like I'm interested in putting into like the way I skate. And then what do I like about skating a popsicle deck? I like the symmetry, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video. I have skated a square nose and tail deck, and I found that I didn't like that because it's really hard to rail flip on a square nose and tail deck. It felt like it'd be super secure if I was doing lots of nose slides and tail slides or skating in transition. That felt like awesome, like having such a big surface area for my board. But because I do some of those, I do some rail stuff in rail stand, I didn't really like it. And then too pointy of a deck, it's kind of harder to balance like in a truck stand or things like that. And I just feel like I've gotten so used to a popsicle shape. That's why I like it. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Because I've never done rail cuts on any of my own boards. I think I just like the shape that I've had and haven't wanted to change it much more. I definitely played around with the nose and tail shapes at the end. Like I said, more square, more pointy, things like that, where that taper starts. And just for the way that I skate, I feel really comfortable on that, and I feel like I can do the things I want to do with least resistance on a popsicle shape. Here's a board building question. What is the best way to build wheel wells without a CNC machine? And how did you start open source boards? The best way to build wheel wells without a CNC machine, the way that I do it, because I actually don't use the CNC machine that I have access to for making wheel wells, because I'm doing so many custom boards, it would just take too long to set up for just like one board, is with a like drum sander or a belt sander, like the end of a belt sander. There's like a rounded off portion. And it's not super easy though, of course. You have to manually, what I do is I create a template for the top of the wheel well, which is on the bottom of the board. It's confusing. And then a template for the side. So it's like this like kind of like a teardrop shape template. And there's two of them. So one that goes on the bottom of the board where the wheel well is going to be, and then one that goes on the side. So basically I know how deep and where it is, and then I carve away with like the end of a belt sander. I actually made, so it's funny that this was asked about because I've been working on a jig that makes this easier and makes it easier to do this more consistently, because it's kind of like sculpting right now. Once you get started, like you have your lines as guidelines, which does help a lot, but there's still some manual skill involved in making sure everything is good and lined up. So I am working on some sort of jig to make this easier for myself, and once it's available, I'd like to make it available for purchase on the website so that others without a CNC machine can make wheel wells in this way. I've also used one of those those shore form rasps to kind of carve away at some wheel wells too. So that's another thing to check out. But yeah, I'd stick with the create yourself, just make like a paper template to make sure they're all the same, align it, make sure you have the wheel wells in all the same spots, and and check where you're getting wheel bite on a board you already have, like with the similar trucks and wheels, so you know where to optimally place the wheel wells. So that's my recommendation for that. I'll keep you guys posted. If you're not subscribed to the Open Source Skateboards email newsletter, go to the website and subscribe to that. That's where I kind of announce any new products and things like that first. So make sure you're signed up for that if you're interested in hearing about that. And how did I start open source boards? It can be a long story. I'll give you the short version. I wanted a symmetrical skateboard. I wanted a board that was also built using sustainably sourced materials and used eco-friendly materials. And at the time, I wasn't aware of many companies that were promoting really either of those. And I just felt like there wasn't a brand that I connected with that well. And I wanted to start working with my hands more. So I started Open Source Boards, and the name came from, so basically before I started this, I was living in Pennsylvania and there wasn't like a skate shop really close by to me, and I'd have to order my boards online and base a purchase off of just like a few specs, like width and what it looked like. And it's gotten a little bit better now. There's a little bit more information, but I really wanted to understand all the angles and dimensions of a skateboard shape. So when I first started this, I first started prototyping boards, I would take my designs, and at the very beginning, I had like 2 model skateboards that I was making that I had actually made by a small company in Canada. And they produced like a batch of 100 of these boards, and which are actually almost like all gone. I think they are all gone now. I think I have like a couple just here, but for the most part, those are all gone. And I lost my train of thought for a second. Oh, company in Canada. I took those designs that I had made and published them on the website along with the mold file. So you had essentially the blueprint and the mold files online. So it was, the skateboard design was open source, so that somebody else wanted to make and design their own board, they knew what this shape was based on, what the dimensions were for this shape. And it was meant as a way to kind of share this information so that skaters can better understand what works best for them, rather than just saying like, oh yeah, I like a real shape, or a girl, or a toy machine, or an almost, or whatever, or I like an 8 or a 7.5 or a 9, or giving a little bit more definition to terms like mellow, steep, and all that. So that's where the name came from. That's basically how I started it. There's a lot more involved, but that's the short story. All right, next question. Will you be putting out a part soon? I don't have any plans to. I think the last part I put out was in March, early March or February of this year. It was right before like everything, there was like the shutdown of everything. And that was a really fun video. If you haven't seen that, check it out. I haven't posted it on YouTube. It is on the producer's YouTube channel though. It was produced or filmed and edited by Dan Malabuyo. He creates awesome quality videos. So I'll link to that video in the description for you to check out. It also features Lance Lynn, who's a professional freeline skater, free skates. They're like these two little like individual platforms you stand on that are kind of like roller blades but sideways. Just watch the video. And Josh Flores, a sponsored longboard dancer. So that was the last video, but yeah, I'm not sure when the next one will be. How do you prevent boards to warp once it's done? Warping is a big issue in board building. And you can mitigate this with a few things. I know the answer was once it's done, but I think preventing warping is really the key thing here. So have an even glue up. If you have an uneven deposition of glue, if you have like too much glue in one area and not enough somewhere else, it's going to cause the wood to like swell more in the wetter areas. So make sure your glue up's even. Next, don't alternate the cup of the veneers. This is what I thought I was supposed to be doing when I first started building boards. And basically, when you're making a board, a veneer, the thin sheet of wood, might be like warped slightly. It might have a slight cup or bend in it, like a U shape. And what I'd heard you should do is alternate the cup to prevent warping. So you have one that's U down, then a U up, U down, U up. And I was doing that. And then as soon as I stopped doing that as an experiment, most of my boards, I have seen very little warping, thankfully. And I stack the cup up first on the first veneer I'm doing, and then all the rest are cup down after that. And the reason I do the cup up one first is it just kind of helps seal in the wetness of the wood glue so that it's not exposed to the air. Like, I guess it would still be that way. It's just when you have them like that, the edges dry out really quick. So I'm basically just doing that to prevent the glue from drying on that first veneer. And then just cup down so that the cup is in the direction of the concave, and that tends to work. Also, make sure you rotate the veneers 180 degrees when you do that, so you don't stack inconsistencies in the wood veneer on top of each other. Because if you're making boards, you've probably noticed there's some, when you get like a stack of veneer, you might see some that look like they're from like the exact same spot on the tree. And if they have like a crack in that one spot, like just rotate it so that crack's over here this time, and you're not stacking up a bunch of cracks or weaker spots in the wood on top of themselves, which would not be good. Some other things, clear coating. There's a couple ways I've heard of people clear coating and treating their board afterwards. So I guess I should also mention veneer storage before I get into that. So veneer storage, your raw veneers, and even your finished board, it's really important to keep this all really consistent. Don't have your veneers sitting like outside where they can get like rained on, where the temperature's varying, where it gets really humid. Try and have some sort of temperature and humidity control and moisture, and definitely don't have them where they can get wet. Clear coat, back to that. I clear coat as quickly as I can after I've taken the board out of the press. A lot of the factories, I think, let their boards sit and acclimate for a few days in their shop, and they stack them on top of each other. I've seen at least one video recently where this was explained, that they stack them on top of each other to basically help them retain their shape, because if you just leave them out, like if I just left one of my uncut boards out for a couple days, it would probably warp. So I try and clear coat it to preserve the moisture content of the wood as soon as I take it out. What that means though is that the board will likely be a little softer than like a board made in a factory, because it's retaining some of that moisture that was added into the wood from a water-based wood glue, if you're using a water-based wood glue. If you're using epoxy, it doesn't really affect that, but most of you building, I'm sure, are using a water-based wood glue like Titebond or Multibond Skate or SK8. So I like to clear coat right away. I don't think, like, the board doesn't feel significantly softer. I don't feel like my pop is compromised. If anything, I feel like the board's a little bit longer lasting because it's not as brittle as a board that's been really dried out. So that's just my opinions on it. Oh, and then lastly, don't, even once it's clear coat, don't leave your board out in the sun, in heat, or with weight on it. Like, don't throw it in the trunk of your car and then put a bunch of stuff on it and then go park your car and it's like 90 degrees outside. That is just asking for it to warp and deform. The good news is, if that does happen, you can warp it back using the same exact thing, heat and pressure, to soften up the wood glue and clamp it. You could, there's a couple of YouTube videos on unwarping boards that you can check out. But I think the key thing is really just getting your glue up consistent, keeping the cups of the veneer cupped down, and clear coating as soon as possible out of the press. Next question. How much pressure is needed in a traditional mold versus a roar rocket mold? I.e., are traditional cavity presses holding a deck under how much load? 5 tons, 10 tons, or 30 tons, etc. So this depends on like the wood and the glue you use, but for the most part, most of us are using like maple and like a water-based wood glue like Titebond 3 or Multibond Skate. And I actually have some notes here about this. So the adhesive will say how much pressure is required to achieve a bond on the label. But I have this, I guess it's a letter that I found on the Roar Rocket website from a Franklin technical expert, and Franklin is the company that makes both Titebond 3 and Franklin Multibond Skate. And it reads, the actual pressure required on any given bond is really a combination of the pressure required to pull the layers of wood together and the pressure required to squeeze out the excess glue. When working with something like a thin veneer, the wood offers almost no resistance, and the pressure applied only needs to squeeze out the excess glue. While vacuum pressure is indeed quite modest, it is usually sufficient to create a thin enough layer of glue and a bond good enough to resist any stress which may ultimately develop in the veneer. And it goes on and basically talks about, like, the idea here is that the spec is a more broad spec to cover like gluing big chunks of wood together that aren't really meant to fit precisely together. But a veneer, which is very flexible, when you compress it, it doesn't need as much force to bond everything together because it's flexible. And just from experience, my own and everyone else that's been using the Roar Rocket vacuum bagging method, the pressure is enough to make a skateboard. The wood holds together extremely well, and the quality is great. And the only limitation we sometimes see is with extreme bends, but that can be overcome with clamps. So if you're making like a longboard drop deck, you can use clamps and just do a multi-stage layup, which for most longboards, it's a good idea to do a multi-stage layup anyways to minimize the working time so your glue doesn't dry out too soon. And with something like wheel flares, I use clamps all the time to basically press the wood down into those flares. And in those areas, it does require more force or more pressure than what the vacuum bag can provide. The vacuum bag is limited to whatever atmospheric pressure is in your area. If we're assuming there's a perfect vacuum, it's about 15 pounds per square inch, a little less than that if you're at sea level. And if you're at altitude, it's going to be even less than that. So for a traditional press, the minimum I've heard, I think, was like 5 or 6 tons for pressing one board at a time in like a hydraulic 2-part press. And I think what's very common is 40-ton presses for making boards. And I know that I've had boards manufactured that were pressed 4 at a time in a 40-ton press that were fairly steep, and the quality came out great. And I would recommend, if you're gonna get a press, to go for like a 40-ton press. I don't think they're terribly more expensive than like a 10-ton or a 20-ton press, but it's just nice to have that extra capacity, even if you don't end up using it, to press your boards. So if you're designing your own press, the structure, make sure it's strong enough to withstand any deflection or cracking or shearing or anything like that, any failure modes with that much force, with about 40 tons of force. And also make sure your molds are precisely machined so that the faces are properly offset. The bottom face of your mold, it's a 2-part mold is not simply a mold that's been cut and has the same, like when you hold a 2-part mold together for skateboards, the faces actually shouldn't mate perfectly. They should be slightly off to account for the offset in veneers. For example, if you have a concave radius of 20 inches and the boards you're pressing are each a 1/2 inch thick, and you are pressing 4 at a time, then you have to say, okay, well, 20 inches and then plus a 1/2 times 4 is 2 inches. So the radius on the top face mold should be 22 inches. I think I did that math right. I know I'm kind of in flow and I don't do mental math well when I'm like trying to explain something. I like to have like a chalkboard or something. But anyways, I think that you get basically the radius on the bottom is going to be a different radius than on the top. And you need to do that with 3D modeling to effectively get that proper offset. Or you could do other things, but I'm not going to get into that now. I would recommend like 40 tons for a press. You could probably get away with less, but do a little bit of research. The glue manufacturer specs are good to follow, but if you have like valid data or numbers that prove otherwise, like the roll rocket method, like it's only 15 pounds per square inch, not 175, and like that works. Go and take advantage of having that data. Next question. Can you press all 7 plies at the same time, or do you need to do it in 3 separate pressings, 3-ply, then 3-ply, then 2-ply? Yes, you can press all 7 at the same time, but you need to do it within a certain amount of time. So if you are pressing your first board and you expect to be going through a little slowly, I would recommend maybe just doing, and this is only good for the roll rocket method, I should mention, because with a 2-part mold, it's designed for a certain amount of thickness to be offset. So if you have too few veneers in there, it's not going to be a good press. So if we're strictly talking about the roll rocket method here, and yes, you can press all 7 at the same time. I usually do, I press all 7 at the same time when I'm doing street size boards with like 9.5 by 34-inch veneers around that size. If I'm making a board with more veneers or that's longer, I split it up. I've found that I made an 8-ply longboard once, all in one glue up. I know this is only one data point essentially, but that one warped, and it seems like boards that I try and do too much and I kind of push the limits on the working time, basically the time that there's glue on the time between when I start gluing the board and the time between when it's pressed, they seem to be a little bit more likely to warp, surprisingly, interestingly, and also delaminate, which is not very surprising. Like the edges as the board hits the ground are probably gonna chip away a little bit more easily. So I haven't had much issues with doing 7-ply. I haven't had really any issues with doing 7-plies all in one go. And factories are doing like, you know, a bunch of boards at once. It really depends on your speed. So the working time for a glue like Type On 3, I think, is around 10 minutes. So if you don't think you can get all 7 in within 10 minutes, then split up your glue up. If it's a board for you and you don't care how it performs and you want to see, then just do what you think you can and embrace if it doesn't work out. It's always good to just try it yourself and see what you can get away with. So I hope that answers that question. Next question, what's your opinion on measuring boards with the concave versus just straight across from end to end? For example, kick to kick could be 31.5, but the measuring tape pressed against the concave would be different. I like to measure straight. So all the measurements, like if you see any of my drawings that I've done, like I just give a drawing, like a top view drawing from like here to here. I don't lay the measuring tape across here. There's so many different things that need to be taken into account if you start doing that, because this board might be 32 inches tip to tip if you just go straight across like in a top view. And if you're measuring it by pressing the tape, it's going to be like 34 or 35 inches maybe. I haven't checked this, but because it's got to follow all these curves, and it just gets a little confusing. Nose and tail length is like that too, of course. That's like the tricky one. So you basically have to kind of look directly over your measuring tape and see where things line up. It's not ideal, and there's not like a great way to measure this right now. And I don't even know if there's an industry standard. I've spoken with some guys that think it should be measured differently. I have the little help button on SkateCAD to show you how I measure everything, because I find that that's most helpful for understanding how the parameters affect boards across different shapes and geometries. Do you calculate the length of the concave transition based on how steep the concave is? Or do you simply use the same length, i.e. 4 inches in your videos? Like the kick gap and the general rule of thumb of 1 inch or 2 fingers of flat from the professor, I used the roll rocket method and spotted that my concave transition angle is probably too steep as the veneers do not touch the mold at some point. The transition section of the mold where the board transitions from having concave, like this section, to the kick, there's this piece right here. And this is a tricky part because this is where the wood is bending in 2 directions at once, which means it is stretching and compressing more than anywhere else in the board, because it's basically trying to be this length here and then this length here, and it gets hairy. And with the roll rocket method, yeah, unless you have like a really mild concave, you'll notice that when you press the board, it doesn't compress there unless you use clamps. I, as a rule of thumb, like to use 4 inches as a reference, because that's generally, like without clamps, roughly where it will be. Now, if you have a steeper concave, it's going to go further using the roll rocket method, because it's going to take longer to go and bend really deep, and because the wood's going to want to distribute that stress across a bigger area. With hydraulic pressing, it's tough. I've been looking into this more and like doing some strain calculations and trying to better understand where the threshold is for how much you can get the wood to stretch and what the trade-off is. Ultimately, you want that distance, this shape, this curve right here, to be as short as possible, or this length. Like if you laid a string across this, you want that length to be as short as possible, or as close as possible to the length across the flat of the board, to basically minimize the amount of stretching that has to occur. So 4 inches is what I recommend. You can get most things to bend with 4 inches with the rocket method with clamps. It's going to take some trial and error though if you're doing this with a 2-part press, and that's why one of the reasons why I like the raw rocket method so much is it is a lot more affordable to prototype and experiment and figure that kind of stuff out. So if you're developing shapes with hydraulic pressing, be prepared to make somewhat of a significant investment in molds for doing so. I hope that answered that question. I know it's kind of a weird area on the board, and there's not a lot of information in board building about how to really design that shape. And I do talk a little bit about it in my online class in the modeling section, the 3D modeling section of the class. Okay, last question that I'm going to answer for this video. I can't believe this video has been flying by. Tell us about yourself. How did you start skating? Who are your biggest inspirations? Are you mostly into freestyle, or do you do street and vert as well? Ever tried downhilling? That could be a big question. I'm going to keep it brief though. How did I start skating? I guess I just started, like I was at a friend's house and they had a skateboard, and I got on it and I liked it, and I asked for one for Christmas, I think, and I got one for Christmas, and yeah, I just kind of was one of the few things that I tried when I was younger that stuck. So that's how I started. Biggest inspirations, I'm assuming this is skate style inspirations or skateboarders, like and I'm gonna reference someone that probably most of you have never heard of. I think Takashi Suzuki is has one of the coolest styles, and that definitely, seeing his style is inspiring to me in terms of like how I want to skate more, and in terms of seeing someone just use their skateboard so differently than everyone else, and in a way that is very smooth, and like just the overall vibe is really enjoyable to watch. So I'll link to his, just check out the description of the video to see some of his skating that I'll link to. Am I mostly into freestyle? So when I started skating, like my first 15 years of skating, I was pretty much mostly just like street. I had ramps and stuff in my driveway and boxes and rails, and I would skate like a ledge. That was like my favorite thing to skate, was ledges. It wasn't until after college that I got more into freestyle, and that was around the time I discovered freestyle too. I was always like fascinated by like seeing Rodney Mullen skate and like doing rail stands. Like that was like the one freestyle thing I would occasionally do. It was like a rail stand. And then when I started seeing some of Brett Novak's videos, which is like right around the time I finished college, I was living somewhere where we didn't have like a lot of spots to like really a close by skate park, and I was limited with my time because I was working full time. So I would just go skate like a parking lot or a tennis court or basketball court just because it was close and convenient and smooth, and seeing some freestyle stuff was really inspiring. It gave me new ideas, and it was just easier to get into. It was more convenient and more free. I felt like I could just do it anywhere. So I definitely don't do vert. I'm terrible at transition. I just like don't know how to do anything in trans. I have a hard time with transition. Like I cruise around, I have fun cruising around, but I don't really go above the coping very much at all. And downhilling, I actually did. Right before I started making boards about 7 years ago, I bought a downhill board and got a little bit into downhilling. I like learned a Coleman slide, and I still have my slide pucks, and yeah, that was pretty fun. I haven't done it much since I haven't done it much since like 6 or 7 years ago. But I don't know, maybe I'll get back into it at some point. There's a lot of cool different styles that are out there. So that's a little tiny bit about me. Anyways, thank you guys for submitting these questions. I hope that they were helpful and interesting. Let me know if you like this format of video. I'm working on some more videos. I'm sorry I haven't been putting out that much lately. I do intend on creating some more useful stuff. And of course, I do see your feedback. So if you want to see, if there's any specific type of video or resource you'd like to see made, let me know. Right now, I just kind of switch it up between skateboarding trick tips and board design and building stuff and little projects like that. So thank you for your support. Thank you for helping us get to 3,000 subscribers. That's really, really awesome. That's super cool. And check out that online workshop if you have any interest in it, and sign up for the email list if you aren't signed up already. I send an email out like once a month, maybe twice a month, and it's just helpful things and new products and things like that that might be available. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Welcome to the Open Source Skateboards online skateboard and longboard design build workshop. This workshop is a video version of my in-person board building classes, which I've been running for the last 5 years. I've personally been skating for 20 years and building boards for over 6 years. As you build your own board alongside me, you'll learn board design, modeling, mold making, pressing, shaping, and finishing so that you'll be able to make your own custom boards at home. I hope you'll join me and open up possibilities with your skating and creativity by making your own custom skateboards and longboards.